You were never free. You were trained to call your cage by a different name. The rules weren't made for your sake. The moment you learned what punishment meant, you learned to obey. And somewhere inside you already knew that the people demanding your obedience didn't care about you. They cared about keeping you manageable, not from love. From the specific terror that an uncontrolled person produces in someone who has already surrendered their own will to the structure. Think about what you were told was virtuous. Humility, self-sacrifice, patience. Now ask yourself the question no one in your life has had the courage to put to you directly. Who profits from your humility? Who benefits when you wait your turn, swallow your ambition, and call it grace? The meek do not inherit the earth. They fertilize it. You have been taught to call your submission morality. You have been conditioned to feel pride in your own containment. And here is the most precise diagnosis of your condition. You do not merely obey. You have learned to love obeying. The cage does not need a lock when the prisoner has been trained to guard the door himself. This is the problem of the herd. Not that powerful people exploit the weak. That is simply nature conducting its business. The true catastrophe is that the weak have constructed an entire theological and moral architecture to justify their own exploitation, to make it sacred, to make resistance feel like sin. They have taken their wound and framed it on the wall and called it a virtue. Look at your social circle. Examine it with cold eyes. How many of those relationships are built on genuine admiration? And how many are built on mutual agreement not to become more than what you currently are? Your friends do not celebrate your ascent. They celebrate your presence at their level. Your ambition makes them uncomfortable because it implies a verdict about their own stasis. And so the herd moves together, not towards something, but away from the terror of standing alone. The safe world you believe in, the world of deserved rewards and fair systems and good people triumphing over bad, is not a comforting truth. It is a sedative. It is what the shepherd tells the sheep so they walk calmly through the gate that you have never looked up to examine, the gate that only opens in one direction. You are not reading philosophy right now. You are receiving a diagnosis. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Röcken, Prussia, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died of a brain disease when Friedrich was 4 years old. Make note of that. The man who would spend his intellectual life destroying the foundations of Christian morality grew up in a household of women, his mother, sister, grandmother, devout, suffocating, well-meaning. He was the good boy. He excelled. He became, at 24, the youngest ever professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. And then something happened that the academic establishment has never quite forgiven him for. He began to think. Not the kind of thinking that decorates an existing structure, the kind that identifies the structure as a prison and begins removing load-bearing walls. His colleagues were appalled. His early work, The Birth of Tragedy, was dismissed as unscholarly, which, in the vocabulary of academia, means it was too honest to be safely contained within professional categories. He lost students, he lost peers, he lost his health. By his early 30s, plagued by near blindness, violent migraines, and what we would now likely identify as a constellation of neurological disorders, he was writing in the dark, sometimes literally, dictating scratching notes, a man whose body was being destroyed in direct proportion to the clarity of his vision. His sister, Elizabeth, who would later edit his work to serve the proto-nationalist ideology he specifically and repeatedly rejected, called herself his guardian. She was his contaminator, and yet without her archival obsession, much of what he wrote would have perished. Power preserves what it can weaponize. That has always been the nature of legacy. He collapsed in Turin in January 1889, throwing his arms around the neck of a horse being flogged in the street. the final, shattering image of a man who had written so cold-bloodedly about strength, broken finally by his encounter with suffering's most naked form. He never recovered his sanity. He lived 11 more years as a vegetable, his work exploding across Europe as he sat unknowing. Consider this passage from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Man must be surpassed. What is the ape to man? A laughingstock or a painful embarrassment, and man shall be just that to the Übermensch, a laughingstock or a painful embarrassment. Do not receive this as inspiration. That is the comfortable misreading. What Nietzsche is performing here is an act of surgical cruelty toward the concept of human self-satisfaction. The ape does not know it is an ape. It does not feel the indignity of its limitation because it has no conceptual access to what it lacks. And Nietzsche's point, the point that makes his contemporaries flinch and makes modern readers reach reflexively for a softening interpretation, is that you are the ape, right now. In your current form, with your current values, your current ambitions, your current ceiling of self-conception, you are the creature that will be looked back upon as a transitional embarrassment, not a villain, not a hero, a phase. From On the Genealogy of Morality, the passage that functions as the exposed nerve of his entire project, the slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values, the resentment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. Resentment. He uses the French deliberately, because the German language did not have a word precise enough for what he was describing. It is not simple resentment. It is the specific psychic maneuver of the powerless who, unable to act against those above them, turn their impotence inward and transmute it into a moral system. The weak do not merely envy the strong. They redefine the strong as evil, elevate their own weakness as righteousness, and call the entire operation God's will. This is not pessimism. This is an autopsy. The moral systems you were raised inside, Christian ethics, democratic egalitarianism, the culture of participation trophies, are not civilization's achievements. They are civilization's most sophisticated mechanism of control, built from the bottom up by those who could not compete and so change the rules of the game. From beyond good and evil, the noble type of man regards himself as a determiner of values. He does not require to be approved of. He passes the judgment. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. What Nietzsche is identifying is not arrogance. He is identifying ontological self-possession. The noble individual, his Übermenschian archetype, does not look outward for validation before acting. He does not ask whether the herd approves. His values are not inherited, they are generated. He is the source, not the recipient. Now hold that mirror to yourself for exactly 3 seconds. When you last made a significant decision, career, relationship, expression of belief, how many committee meetings did you conduct in your skull before acting? How many phantom jurors did you address? How many people who are not in the room do you still perform for, daily, compulsively, without ever being asked? From Twilight of the Idols. What does not kill me makes me stronger, but only if you are constituted for strength to begin with. He did not write that second clause, but he meant it. The sanitized motivational poster version of Nietzsche is the final, darkest irony of his legacy. The philosopher who diagnosed the herd's need for comfortable slogans has himself been reduced to one. What the full sentence requires you to acknowledge is that suffering does not ennoble indiscriminately. It destroys the weak and refines the strong. And if you have been treating difficulty as automatically redemptive, if you have been finding meaning in your own suffering as a substitute for action, you have committed the slave morality error in its purest form. Now we apply the blade to the present. Modern corporate structures are not, at their foundational level, meritocracies. They are dominance hierarchies that have learned to use the language of meritocracy as sedation. The performance review, the company value statement, the open door policy. These are not mechanisms of fairness. They are mechanisms of compliance normalization, tools that make the employee feel heard enough to continue producing, without ever altering the fundamental geometry of who holds power and who executes instructions. This is resentment institutionalized. The worker who genuinely believes that good performance will be noticed and rewarded has not understood the system. He has been successfully installed into it. Examine the stratagem of the performance review specifically. You are asked annually to evaluate yourself, to identify your own weaknesses, to set your own goals. This feels empowering. It is the opposite. You have been recruited to perform the labor of your own management. You generate the data used to contain you. The psychic cost is yours. The control remains theirs. Michel Foucault called this disciplinary power, the shift from external enforcement to internalized surveillance. Nietzsche called it slave morality. The names differ. The mechanism is identical. Political movements follow the same cartography of subservience. Consider the French Revolution, that great sacred event in the Western democratic mythology, that beacon of human liberation. Examine it without the mythology. The peasantry, inflamed by genuine suffering, rose against the aristocracy and proceeded to construct, within 5 years, a terror apparatus that killed more French citizens than the regime it replaced, before collapsing into the iron grip of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who understood, with Nietzschean precision, that the masses needed to feel liberated more than they needed to be liberated. He gave them glory. He gave them identity. He gave them the feeling of forward motion. And they gave him an empire. The revolution did not destroy the master-slave dynamic. It reshuffled the personnel and redrew the uniform. The herd still needed a shepherd. They simply demanded the right to choose which shepherd would herd them. Now examine the Stanford prison experiment of 1971. Philip Zimbardo divided ordinary college students into guards and prisoners in a simulated prison. Within 6 days, the experiment had to be terminated. Not because the designated guards became monstrous, though they did, but because the designated prisoners began to internalize their captivity. They stopped thinking of themselves as students playing a role. They began to petition, to comply, to seek small favors, to manage their relationship with their captors. They had not been broken by force. They had been broken by the logic of the structure itself. The uniform was enough. The role was enough. Give a human being a position in a hierarchy and watch how rapidly they become the avatar of that position, surrendering their prior identity to the demands of their new function. This is not an anomaly. This is the operating system. The machinations of social hierarchies function on this same predation of identity. The middle manager who enforces a policy he privately finds absurd. The academic who dismantles a student's unconventional thinking to protect the orthodoxy that funds his tenure. The parent who crushes a child's divergence because the neighborhood's regard for the family unit is worth more than the child's authentic development. Every one of these actors believes at the level of conscious narration that they are acting in service of something larger than themselves. They are not wrong. They are, in fact, perfectly serving the larger structure. What they have failed to perform is the Nietzschean operation, the examination of whether that structure deserves their service. Here is the darker motive beneath every act of institutional loyalty. Fear, not love of institution, not genuine belief in its values, fear of the identity vacuum that would exist without it. The corporate soldier does not defend his company because it is just. He defends it because without it, he would have to confront who he is when he is not a title on a business card. Strip away the vocabulary of virtue from the concept of cooperation. What remains? Strategic subservience. The colleague who helps you today is banking a debt. The mentor who guides you is extending their influence through your success. The philanthropist who funds hospitals has purchased something more durable than property, the right to be spoken of as good. The moral economy is not separate from the power economy. It is its most sophisticated expression. History offers no cleaner case study in the mechanics of this truth than the assassination of Julius Caesar, specifically the role of Marcus Junius Brutus. Caesar trusted Brutus. This is not a minor biographical detail, it is the structural key. Brutus was not an enemy. He was a friend, an intimate, a man Caesar had publicly favored and privately loved. And this is precisely why he was weaponized. The conspirators did not recruit Brutus for his tactical capacity. They recruited him for his moral reputation. His presence in the act of assassination transformed it in the public perception of Rome, say from a power grab into a principled civic act. He was not the blade, he was the justification for the blade. His decency, his genuine, widely attested belief that he acted for the Republic, was the most precise and effective weapon in the entire operation. The good man's goodness was harvested, targeted, and detonated. What was Brutus's darker motive? Perhaps there was none, at the conscious level. And that is what makes it the purest example. He was not corrupt. He was used because he was incorruptible. His virtue made him the perfect instrument of someone else's will. The man with no shadow is the easiest to cast a shadow from. You are Brutus, not in the sense that you are about to betray someone, in the sense that your goodness, your genuine, felt, privately held commitment to fairness and decency is your primary tactical liability, and you have spent your entire life cultivating it because the people who raised you needed you contained. Think about when you last said yes when the biological signal in your chest was screaming no. Not out of cowardice, at least not as you narrated it. Out of kindness, out of not wanting to hurt someone, out of being in your own private mythology, the type of person who shows up, who carries weight, who does not leave others stranded. And you felt, in that moment, a subtle warmth, the warmth of self-regard, the satisfaction of confirming your own narrative of yourself as a good person. That warmth is the leash. Nietzsche would not call you evil for this. He would call you sick. In the specific medical sense, a will that has been inverted on itself, that has learned to derive pleasure from its own diminishment. The inner slave is not a metaphor. It is a psychic structure, a set of reward pathways built up across years of conditioning that has fused your sense of identity with your capacity for self-abnegation. You feel most like yourself when you are giving something away. You feel most virtuous when you are most diminished. You have learned to call this love. Ask yourself this and hold the question without reaching for the comfortable answer. If the people in your life who depend on your generosity, your patience, your sacrificial availability, if those people discovered a version of you that was unavailable, that was sovereign, that said no with the same ease that they currently receive your yes, would they stay? Or have you been purchasing the relationship with your own subordination, dollar by dollar, year by year, and calling the transaction loyalty? The internal shadow is not your anger. It is not your ambition. Those are the parts of yourself that have been correctly identified as dangerous and have therefore been the most aggressively suppressed. Your internal shadow is the terrifying suspicion, which you have probably never allowed to fully form in your waking mind, that you have wasted a significant portion of your actual life performing a character that other people wrote for you. Your decency is not neutral. It has a cost accounting. Every act of patience that was not freely given but extracted through social pressure, every ambition abandoned because the people around you were not ready to receive it, every thought self-censored before it could be spoken, These are not moral achievements. They are compound interest payments on a debt you never consciously agreed to take on. And here is the accusation that will land with the most precision. You know this. You have always known this. In the 3 a.m. lucidity that you cover quickly with the next obligation, the next scroll, the next performance of normalcy, in that space before the machinery of your self-narrative restarts, you know that the life you are living is significantly authored by other people's comfort. You know that the most frightening version of yourself, the one who refuses, who asserts, say who operates from internal rather than external authority, has been in solitary confinement since approximately the age of 6, fed just enough to stay alive through occasional private fantasy, but never, not once, allowed to walk out into the daylight of your actual choices. The inner slave does not need a master in the room. That is the completed work of conditioning. The master left years ago. You stayed. You kept the rules. You added new ones. And you taught your children the same architecture of self-containment, which you called raising them right. What Nietzsche demands, not asks, demands, is not that you become cruel. Cruelty is merely inverted weakness, the slave who has seized the whip and found, in its use, the only vocabulary of power he was ever taught. What he demands is revaluation. The total, say unsparing examination of every value you hold, every social contract you honor, every good behavior you perform, and the cold determination of whether it reflects your will or someone else's investment. Not whether it feels right, whether it is yours. There is no resolution to offer you here. That is not withholding. That is honesty about the nature of the problem. The inner slave is not killed in a moment of inspiration. It is not excised by reading the right text or arriving at the right intellectual position. It is a structural feature of a personality built under specific historical and social conditions, and the work of dismantling it is long, unpleasant, and deeply socially costly. People who currently benefit from your subservience will not celebrate your transformation. They will pathologize it. They will call it selfishness, arrogance, coldness, which is to say, they will use the exact vocabulary of slave morality to reassert control the moment you threaten to exit its jurisdiction. The power structures you inhabit, professional, familial, social, were not designed for your flourishing. They were designed for your productivity and your compliance, and in most cases those who built them made no deliberate distinction between the two. Nietzsche did not survive his own philosophy. He arrived at the far edge of the thought, and the biological structure that housed the thought gave way. What this means, what it has always meant, is that the path beyond the herd is not safe, is not comfortable, and carries no guarantee of arrival at anything resembling happiness as the herd defines it. What it offers is something colder, and, if you are honest with yourself, are more compelling than happiness, accuracy, the end of performing a self that was designed by committee, the beginning of the terrifying, unscripted, socially uninsured experience of operating from a will that is actually yours. Most people, when they finally understand the cage, do not leave it. They redecorate.